There is a particular kind of person who never seems to wait. You have seen this person. Maybe you have worked beside them or reported to them or watched them from across a room and felt something you could not quite name, a mixture of admiration and mild irritation, the way you feel when someone else does the thing you almost did. They do not have more talent than the people around them, not always. They do not have better credentials, longer experience, or a clearer path. What they have is something quieter and far more consequential. They have stopped waiting for someone to tell them it is their turn. Most people never make that stop. Think about Marcus for a moment. Marcus is 34 years old, 7 years into a career at a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago. He is genuinely good at his job. His managers know it. His colleagues respect him. Every performance review lands in the solid to strong range. And every year, Marcus watches someone get the opportunity he felt was meant for him. A high visibility project, a client relationship, a seat at a table he has been circling for years. Marcus is not bitter exactly. He is confused. He has done everything he was told to do. He has been patient. He has been professional. He has waited for the moment when someone above him would look down, notice his readiness, and say the words he has been waiting to hear. Those words have not come, and they will not come. Not because Marcus lacks ability, not because the system is entirely rigged against him, but because Marcus has been operating from a belief so deeply embedded, he has never once thought to question it. The belief that leadership is something you receive, rather than something you become. That belief is the permission trap, and it is running silently in the background of more careers, more lives, more quietly frustrated mornings than almost any other single force in professional psychology. Here is what makes it so difficult to see. The permission trap does not feel like a trap. It feels like patience. It feels like humility. It feels like respect for process and hierarchy and the way things work. Those are virtues, and the trap uses them as cover. The people who escape it are not arrogant. They are not reckless. They are not the loudest voice in every room or the person who steamrolls others to reach the front. The ones who escape it have simply arrived at a specific psychological turning point, a moment, often quiet and internal, where something fundamental shifts. Before that moment, they were asking, who is going to give me the opportunity? After it, they were asking something else entirely. What am I waiting for? That shift sounds small. It is not small. It is the difference between a career that accumulates experience and a career that accumulates authority. It is the difference between being good at your job and being someone others instinctively follow. It is the difference between watching and doing, between waiting and deciding, between being a passenger in your own professional life and being the one with a hand on the wheel. Ownership is the word most often used to describe this trait. But the word has been diluted. It has been absorbed into corporate language and performance review templates and leadership development seminars until it sounds like a competency to tick off, rather than a fundamental reorientation of how a person relates to their own life. What real ownership looks like in practice is not a behavior. It is a starting point. It is the internal position from which every decision, every action, every response to difficulty originates. Owners do not ask whether something is their responsibility before they engage with it. They ask whether it matters. If it matters, it is theirs. That sounds simple. It runs against years of conditioning. Because from the time most people are children, the message delivered by nearly every institution they pass through is a variation of the same instruction. Wait to be called on. Wait for the assignment. Wait for the green light. Do the thing you were asked to do. Do it well, and someone will notice and reward will follow. That model worked in a specific era for a specific kind of work. The world those instructions were designed for no longer exists in the same shape. But the instructions remained, and they were passed on. And somewhere along the way, waiting became the default, and the people who refused to wait started pulling away from the rest. The gap between those two groups is not a gap in intelligence. It is not a gap in work ethic or ambition or even skill. It is a gap in psychological positioning. It is a gap in who a person believes themselves to be in relation to the environment around them. This is not about status games or aggressive self-promotion. Those things are often a distraction from the real work. The real work is internal. It is the slow, sometimes uncomfortable process of dismantling a belief system about permission and authority and who gets to lead, and rebuilding something more honest in its place. That work is what this audiobook is about. And the reason it matters is not abstract. The reason it matters is Marcus, sitting in another meeting, watching another person take the seat he qualified for years ago. The reason it matters is the gap between the life you're capable of and the life you're currently living. That gap has a name, and understanding it clearly is the first step toward closing it. But here is what almost nobody tells you about that first step. It is not a step forward, it is a step inward. And what you find there will surprise you. Nobody teaches a child to wait for permission. They do not have to. The lesson arrives automatically, encoded into the structure of almost every environment a child passes through, long before the child has the language to name what is happening to them. Consider what school actually trains, not the content. The content is almost beside the point. What school trains, at a structural level, is a relationship between the individual and authority. You sit when told, you speak when called upon, you complete the task as specified, not as you imagined it. You are assessed by someone above you, and that assessment determines your value. The feedback loop runs in one direction only, downward. And the child who learns to navigate this system well, the child who earns the gold stars and the high marks and the teacher's approval, learns something profound and largely invisible. They learn that the correct move is always to wait for the signal. There is a girl named Priya who was exactly that child. Brilliant, organized, deeply attuned to what each teacher wanted and how to deliver it. She graduated near the top of her class at every stage. University was more of the same. Identify what is being asked for. Produce it at the highest possible level. Receive validation. Advance. By 26, she was working at a financial services firm in Toronto, performing at a level her managers openly described as exceptional. And then something strange happened. The environment changed. The structured feedback loops of education, where the right answer always existed and the criteria for success were always provided, gave way to a professional world that was messier, more ambiguous, and far less interested in telling her what to do next. Nobody handed Priya a rubric. Nobody defined success for her current role and then waited patiently while she optimized for it. The people advancing around her were not waiting for clarity. They were generating it. They were deciding what mattered and then acting on that decision before anyone asked them to. Priya was not failing, but she had the quiet, persistent sense of running on a treadmill, moving constantly and arriving nowhere. The skills that had made her exceptional in every previous environment were not transferring into the currency that her current environment actually rewarded. What she was experiencing is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most common and least discussed transitions in professional life. The shift from environments that reward execution to environments that reward initiative. The shift from being assessed on how well you follow to being assessed, informally, continuously, and with lasting consequence, on whether you lead. Most people are not prepared for this shift, not because they lack capability, but because nothing in their formation ever required them to practice it. Ask yourself honestly, how many times in your own life have you had a clear sense of what needed to be done and chosen to wait anyway? Not because you lacked the authority to act, not because someone told you to wait, but because the habit of waiting was so deeply ingrained that acting without explicit instruction felt vaguely wrong, presumptuous even, like reaching for something that had not yet been offered to you. That feeling has a source, and the source is not weakness of character. It is the logical output of a system that spent years rewarding you for waiting and penalizing you for acting out of turn. The permission trap is not a personal failing. It is an institutional inheritance. But here is where it becomes genuinely dangerous, because the people who eventually pull ahead are not the ones who had different training. Most of them went through the same schools, the same performance-managed workplaces, the same approval-seeking environments as everyone else. The difference is that at some point, consciously or not, they began to question the operating system rather than simply running it. They started to notice that the rules they were following had been written for a different game, not a dishonest game. The rules served a real purpose at a specific stage of development, but a game whose season had ended without announcement, and continuing to play by those rules in a new environment was not humility. It was a mismatch, a costly, career-long mismatch that most people never consciously identify. Workplaces reinforce this trap in ways that are worth examining carefully. Many organizations, particularly large ones, are structured around approval chains and sign-off hierarchies and escalation protocols. On paper, these systems exist for coordination and risk management, and often they serve that purpose genuinely. But they also produce a psychological side effect that nobody designed and nobody discusses. They make waiting feel not just normal, but virtuous. The person who checks with their manager before acting is seen as collaborative. The person who escalates decisions upward is seen as appropriately cautious. The person who holds back until the direction is clear is seen as a safe pair of hands. And all of those things are true at certain moments. The problem is when those behaviors become the default, the permanent setting, the answer to every situation, regardless of what the situation actually calls for. Because organizations also, quietly, informally, consequentially, reward the people who do not wait. They give them the interesting work. They include them in conversations that others are not included in. They remember their names when an opportunity needs to be matched to a person quickly. The formal system rewards waiting. The informal system, the one that actually drives career trajectories, rewards something else. Understanding that gap between what the formal environment appears to reward and what it actually rewards is not cynicism, it is clarity. And clarity, in this particular domain, is the beginning of everything. Priya eventually figured this out, not through a single revelation, but through a slow accumulation of evidence that the map she had been given did not match the territory she was navigating. When she stopped waiting for the territory to change and started changing her map instead, everything shifted. What that map looks like in practice is more specific than most people expect. And it starts not with behavior, but with something that happens long before any behavior is visible at all. There's a moment that happens in almost every meeting, in almost every organization, in almost every professional context on Earth. A problem surfaces. The kind of problem that does not have an obvious owner, that sits in the uncomfortable space between departments or roles or levels of seniority. Everyone in the room is aware of it. Nobody is entirely sure whose job it is to solve it. And so a particular silence settles, brief, almost imperceptible, while everyone waits for someone else to claim it. Watch what happens in that silence. Watch it carefully. Because what you're seeing is not a pause. You are seeing people reveal themselves. Some people look down. Some look toward the most senior person in the room, waiting for a signal. Some begin mentally calculating whether this problem falls inside or outside their defined scope of responsibility. And then, occasionally, one person simply starts talking. Not aggressively, not performatively. They start talking because they have already decided, in some internal place that operates faster than conscious thought, that the problem is theirs. That internal decision is the thing worth understanding, not the behavior it produces. The behavior is just the visible surface. What matters is the cognitive structure underneath it, the specific way ownership thinkers process the world differently, at the level of perception and interpretation, before any action is taken. The first difference is in how they define their role. Passenger thinkers, and that is a useful term, not a harsh one, define their role by its edges. They maintain a clear mental map of what is theirs and what is not, and that map governs where they direct their energy. This is not laziness. It is often a highly rational response to environments that have historically penalized people for overstepping. The boundaries feel like protection. Ownership thinkers define their role by its center. They know their core responsibilities deeply and take them seriously, but their attention is not organized around the question of where their responsibility ends. It is organized around a different question entirely. What does this situation need? That question does not come with a boundary map attached. This distinction produces profoundly different behavior across time, not in dramatic moments, but in the hundreds of small daily decisions that collectively determine a person's trajectory. The email that technically belongs to someone else's inbox, the process that nobody owns but everyone complains about, the new team member who is struggling and whose manager has not noticed yet. Passenger thinkers clock these things and continue. Ownership thinkers clock them and feel a pull, not obligation exactly, but something closer to an inability to walk past a problem without at least considering whether they can help resolve it. The second cognitive difference is in how they interpret setbacks. There is a psychological concept called the locus of control, the degree to which a person believes outcomes in their life are determined by their own actions versus external forces. People with a strong internal locus of control tend to interpret difficulties as problems to be solved. People with a strong external locus tend to interpret the same difficulties as evidence of circumstances beyond their influence. Neither position is entirely accurate. The world is genuinely a mixture of things within our control and things outside it. But the position a person defaults to, the first interpretation their mind reaches for when something goes wrong, shapes everything that follows. It shapes how long they stay in a difficult situation before adapting. It shapes whether they ask what they can do differently or why the situation is unfair. It shapes whether experience accumulates into wisdom or simply accumulates. Ownership thinkers are not deluded about the role of external circumstance. The most effective among them are actually quite clear-eyed about structural realities, systemic obstacles, and the genuine limits of individual agency. What distinguishes them is not a refusal to acknowledge difficulty. It is a refusal to stop there. They acknowledge the obstacle and then they ask the next question. Always. That habit, the automatic reaching for the next question, is one of the most powerful and least discussed cognitive patterns in high performance. Think about that for a moment, because it means that ownership is not optimism. It is not the relentless positivity that fills motivational content. It is something more rigorous than that. It is a disciplined refusal to let the story end at the obstacle. It is the cognitive habit of always writing one more line. The third difference is in their relationship with ambiguity. Most professional environments contain far more ambiguity than their formal structures suggest. Job descriptions are approximations. Organizational charts are maps of reporting lines, not maps of where value actually gets created. Strategy documents describe a direction, not a path. And in the white space between all of these formal structures, enormous amounts of consequential work either gets done or does not get done, depending entirely on who decides to claim it. Passenger thinkers experience ambiguity as a gap in their instructions. They wait for the gap to be filled. Ownership thinkers experience ambiguity as territory, unclaimed, available, potentially valuable territory. They move into it, not recklessly, but with a kind of purposeful curiosity that looks from the outside like confidence, and from the inside feels more like inevitability. There's a man named Daniel, a product manager at a technology company in Seattle, who describes this feeling with unusual precision. He says that when he encounters an ambiguous situation at work, he does not feel uncertain about whether it is his problem. He feels uncertain about how to solve it. That distinction between uncertainty about ownership and uncertainty about method is exactly the difference being described here. One uncertainty paralyzes, the other one energizes. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely. Because these cognitive differences, the role definition, the setback interpretation, the relationship with ambiguity, do not stay invisible. They leak. They express themselves in 1,000 small observable signals that the people around you are reading constantly and fluently, often without any conscious awareness that they are doing so. And those signals are building something about you in the minds of everyone who matters, whether or not you are paying attention to them. Nobody tells you they are forming an opinion about your leadership potential. They do not announce it. There's no meeting scheduled, no formal assessment, no moment where someone sits across from you and says, "I am now going to evaluate whether you are the kind of person I would follow into difficulty." It does not work that way. It has never worked that way. And the fact that most people do not understand how it actually works is one of the most consequential blind spots in professional life. What actually happens is quieter and more continuous and more permanent than any formal evaluation. The people around you, your colleagues, your managers, the senior leaders who barely know your name yet, the clients who have met you twice, are running an ongoing and largely unconscious calibration. They are not asking themselves explicitly whether you are a leader. They are simply noticing things, small things, the kind of things that seem insignificant in isolation and are anything but insignificant in aggregate. Consider a woman named Claire, 38 years old, senior marketing manager at a consumer goods company in London, genuinely talented, widely liked, and for 3 consecutive years passed over for a director role that everyone around her assumed she was the obvious candidate for. When she finally had an honest conversation with a mentor she trusted, what she heard surprised her. It was not her work. Her work was consistently excellent. It was not her relationships. People liked working with her. It was something her mentor struggled to name precisely, but eventually described as a kind of hesitancy, a subtle but persistent pattern of positioning herself slightly behind the action rather than inside it, of framing her contributions as support rather than leadership, of making herself smaller in rooms where she had every right to be large. Claire had not noticed herself doing any of this. That is exactly the point. The signals that shape how others perceive your leadership capacity are largely automatic. They are habits of positioning and language and physical presence that developed over years and now operate below the level of conscious choice, which means that most people are sending a continuous signal about their relationship to ownership and authority without any awareness that the signal is being sent or that it is being received. The research on this is both extensive and humbling. Studies on professional perception consistently show that judgments about a person's leadership potential are formed rapidly within the first few interactions, sometimes within the first few minutes, and that those initial impressions create a cognitive frame through which all subsequent information is filtered. The person who first presents as a follower will have their leadership behaviors discounted. The person who first presents as an owner will have their hesitations forgiven. This is not fair in any absolute sense, but it is real. And understanding it clearly is more useful than resenting it. So what are the signals? What specifically are the people around you reading? And what are those readings telling them? The first signal is how you enter uncertainty. When a situation is unclear, when the path forward is ambiguous, when nobody has yet defined what success looks like, what do? Do you wait for definition to arrive, or do you begin the work of creating it? The people who create definition in ambiguous moments are perceived almost automatically as leaders, not because they are necessarily right, but because they are willing to stand in the open space and begin. The second signal is how you talk about problems. There's a precise and detectable difference between the language of someone who owns a situation and the language of someone who is adjacent to it. Owners say, "We have a problem, and here is what I am doing about it." Passengers say, "There seems to be a problem, and I am not sure whose responsibility it is." These are not just different communication styles. They are different psychological positions, expressing themselves through language. And the people listening to you are registering that difference at a level that bypasses conscious analysis. The third signal is what you do with the credit and the blame. Ownership thinkers distribute credit generously and absorb blame quietly, not as a performance of virtue, but because their internal accounting is genuinely organized around outcomes rather than appearances. People who watch someone consistently do this, deflect credit toward the team, accept responsibility for failures, develop a specific and durable form of trust in that person. The kind of trust that makes them the first name considered when something important needs to be assigned. Ask yourself honestly, when something goes wrong in a project you're connected to, what is your first instinct? To identify what you could have done differently, or to map the external factors that contributed to the outcome? Neither answer makes you a good or bad person, but one of them is building something in the minds of the people around you, and the other is quietly dismantling it. The fourth signal, and perhaps the most underestimated, is your relationship with other people's problems. Do you engage with difficulties that are not formally yours? Not in an overreaching way, but in the way of someone who simply cannot pass a problem without at least offering something useful. This behavior, what organizational psychologists sometimes call proactive helping, is one of the strongest predictors of informal leadership status. It signals an abundance mindset, a team orientation, and most importantly, an ownership relationship with the environment rather than just with a defined role. Claire began paying attention to these signals after a conversation with her mentor, not obsessively, but with a new and useful awareness. She started noticing the moments where she had been habitually stepping back, and she began deliberately and specifically choosing differently, not performing confidence she did not feel, but expressing the genuine capability she had been reflexively concealing. Within 18 months, she had the director role. The signals were always available to her. She simply had not known they were being read. And here's what almost nobody realizes about the invisible audit happening around you right now. The most important reader is not your manager. It is not the senior leader you're trying to impress. It is someone far closer, far more influential, and far more difficult to deceive. The harshest reviewer of your performance is never your manager. It is you. And the relationship you have with that reviewer, the internal voice that evaluates every decision, every outcome, every moment where things did not go as planned, determines more about your long-term trajectory than almost any external factor you could name. This is where ownership thinking becomes genuinely dangerous if it is not understood correctly, because there is a version of radical accountability that looks like leadership from the outside and functions like self-destruction from the inside. And the people who fall into it are often exactly the kind of high-performing, deeply conscientious people who are drawn to ownership as a concept in the first place. Meet Jordan. 29 years old, junior partner at a boutique strategy firm in New York. Jordan is the person who stays latest, thinks hardest, and takes every setback as a personal indictment. When a client presentation lands poorly, Jordan spends 3 days in a private loop of reconstruction. What did I miss? What should I have caught? What does this say about my judgment? When a project runs over timeline, Jordan absorbs the failure completely, even when half the contributing factors were genuinely outside anyone's control. Jordan's colleagues describe him as intensely accountable. Jordan's therapist describes something that sounds considerably less healthy. Jordan has confused accountability with punishment, and this confusion is more common among ambitious people than almost any other single pattern in professional psychology. Real accountability, the kind that builds rather than erodes, is a forward-facing process. It asks, what happened? What was my role in it? And what will I do differently? It is analytical, not emotional. It is interested in information, not in suffering. The goal of genuine accountability is never to feel worse about yourself. The goal is to generate better decisions going forward. Self-punishment, by contrast, is a backward-facing process that disguises itself as accountability. It dwells, it replays, it generates shame rather than insight. And shame, as a substantial body of psychological research consistently demonstrates, is one of the least effective drivers of behavioral change. It feels like discipline. It produces paralysis. The distinction matters enormously in practice because the two processes produce completely different outcomes over time. The genuinely accountable person processes a failure quickly, extracts the relevant information, adjusts, and moves forward. Their relationship with the failure ends when the learning is complete. The self-punishing person carries the failure forward as identity, as evidence of a fundamental inadequacy that future performance must either confirm or desperately disprove. That weight does not make them more careful. It makes them more anxious. And anxious decision-making is reliably worse than calm decision-making. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely. Because the antidote to self-punishment is not self-compassion in the soft sense that phrase sometimes implies. It is not letting yourself off the hook or softening your standards or deciding that outcomes do not matter. The antidote is precision. Surgical, honest, unemotional precision about what actually happened. Here's the practice that the most effective ownership thinkers develop over time. When something goes wrong, they conduct what might be called a clean audit. They separate the event into two categories with complete honesty: the factors they controlled and the factors they did not. Then they focus exclusively on the first category, not to excuse the second, but because the second category is not a productive site of energy expenditure. This sounds straightforward. It is surprisingly difficult to do with genuine honesty because the ego works in both directions. It inflates our sense of control when things go well. We take more credit than is accurate. And it inflates our sense of responsibility when things go wrong. We absorb more blame than is useful. Both distortions serve the ego's need for a coherent story, but neither distortion serves the person actually trying to improve. The clean audit cuts through both. It says, here's what was genuinely mine. Here is what was not. I will think carefully about what was mine. I will note what was not mine and release it, because carrying it produces only noise. Jordan eventually learned this distinction, though not easily and not quickly. What shifted for him was a conversation with a senior partner at his firm, a man in his 50s who had built a remarkable career and who had the unusual quality of appearing completely unburdened by his own past mistakes. Jordan asked him directly how he managed it. The answer was not what Jordan expected. The partner said he had simply decided, at some point in his 30s, that guilt was an indulgence he could not afford, not because he did not care about doing things well, precisely because he cared. Guilt consumed the cognitive and emotional resources he needed for the next problem. The moment he had extracted everything useful from a failure, the file was closed. Not forgotten. Closed. Available for reference, but no longer occupying prime mental real estate. That is not coldness. That is professionalism at its most sophisticated. It is the recognition that your finite supply of mental energy is a resource to be managed, and that genuine accountability is a far more efficient process than the drawn-out self-examination that most ambitious people mistake for rigor. There's also a social dimension to this worth examining, because how you handle your own failures in public, not privately, but in the moments when others can see you, teaches the people around you something important about your character. The leader who acknowledges a mistake clearly, states what they are doing about it, and moves forward without drama creates something in the room, a kind of confidence, a sense that this person can be trusted with difficulty because difficulty does not destabilize them. The leader who over-apologizes, who performs contrition at length, who makes the team spend 20 minutes reassuring them, that person is, however unintentionally, placing their emotional needs above the team's forward momentum. It reads as fragility, not accountability. Real ownership of a mistake is brief, honest, and action-oriented. It sounds like, I got that wrong. Here's what I'm doing about it. Let us continue. Softer than that, and it is avoidance. Longer than that, and it is theater. The line between the two is narrow. But walking it consistently is one of the most powerful professional habits a person can develop. And it connects directly to the question of what leadership actually looks like when no one has given you permission to lead. There is a promotion that never appears on any organizational chart. It happens quietly, informally, and often without the person receiving it fully realizing it has occurred. It is the moment when the people around you, your peers, your team, the colleagues who sit beside you every day, begin treating you as a leader before any title change has made that treatment official, before any announcement, before any salary adjustment, before anyone in a formal position of authority has said the words out loud. This promotion is the one that matters most, because the formal promotion, when it eventually comes, is almost always a confirmation of something that already exists in the room. Organizations rarely elevate people to leadership positions. They recognize people who have already been leading. The title is the receipt, not the transaction. Most people have this sequence reversed in their minds. They believe the title creates the authority. They are waiting for the organizational permission structure to hand them something that, in reality, can only be built from the inside out and demonstrated from the ground up. And while they wait, someone else in the same environment, often with comparable credentials, comparable intelligence, comparable formal standing, is doing the quiet daily work of becoming the person the team already turns to. Consider a team of 8 people at a healthcare technology company in Austin. The team has a manager, a good one, who is stretched across 3 simultaneous projects and therefore present in meeting rooms, but often mentally occupied elsewhere. Into that leadership vacuum, 2 members of the team respond in completely different ways. The first, a man named Robert, notices the vacuum and feels a mixture of frustration and relief. Frustration because the lack of clear direction makes his work harder. Relief because it means less scrutiny of his own output. He continues doing his work well, staying in his lane, waiting for the manager to provide the clarity that the team needs. The second, a woman named Simone, notices the same vacuum and feels something different. Not a gap in her instructions, but an opening. She begins doing small things. She starts sending a brief weekly summary to the team, not because anyone asked her to, not to make herself look good, but because she noticed that the absence of shared information was creating duplication of effort and low-level anxiety. She starts arriving at project meetings with a proposed agenda rather than waiting for one to materialize. When a junior team member is visibly confused about priorities, Simone spends 20 minutes with them on a Tuesday afternoon, not because it is her job, but because the confusion is slowing the work and she can see it. None of these things are dramatic. None of them require special authority. All of them are available to Robert with identical ease. But 6 months later, when the manager is promoted and a replacement is needed, the decision takes approximately 4 days. Simone is not the most senior person on the team. She is the person the team already follows. This is not a story about being strategic or politically savvy or playing a long game. Simone was not performing leadership for an audience. She was simply operating from the ownership position, the internal starting point where the team's outcomes feel genuinely personal, where the environment's problems feel genuinely available to be solved, where waiting for permission to be useful feels not just unnecessary, but slightly absurd. The behaviors that result from that internal position look, from the outside, like leadership, because they are leadership, long before any title confirms it. Here's what almost nobody realizes about this process. The informal authority that Simone built is structurally different from the formal authority that eventually arrived with the title. Formal authority is positional. It exists because of where you sit on a chart. People comply with it because the organizational structure requires them to. Informal authority is relational. It exists because of what you have demonstrated. People follow it because they have decided, based on direct personal experience, that following you produces better outcomes. Positional authority can be granted and revoked. Relational authority, once genuinely built, is almost impossible to take away. It travels with you. It transfers across organizations. It compounds over a career in ways that no title progression can replicate. The people who understand this early build something over a decade that the people who waited for titles simply cannot catch up to. Not because the late starters lack talent, but because the early builders have been accumulating something intangible and durable, a reputation for being the kind of person problems get solved around. That reputation becomes self-reinforcing. Opportunities flow toward it. People recommend you for things they cannot fully articulate why you are right for. The person with a reputation walks into a new environment and finds that their informal authority begins to establish itself within weeks, because they carry the behaviors that built it in the first place. This is the compounding that most career advice ignores, not the compounding of skills, which everyone discusses, but the compounding of demonstrated character, of the accumulated evidence in the minds of everyone who has ever worked alongside you, that you are someone who leads without needing to be asked. Robert, to his credit, eventually understood what had happened. Not bitterly, but clearly. He had been waiting for a signal that the environment was already sending to anyone willing to receive it. He had been conserving energy for an opportunity he was simultaneously making less likely to arrive. The waiting had felt like patience. It had functioned like withdrawal. He changed his approach, slowly, deliberately, with the particular self-consciousness of someone who is rewiring a habit rather than expressing a natural instinct. The rewiring was real. The results followed, but they followed later than they needed to, and with more effort than would have been required if the understanding had arrived sooner. Timing is not everything, but it is not nothing either. And there is one specific moment, one category of situation, where the decision to lead or to wait is made with particular visibility and particular consequence. A moment that most people dread, that ownership thinkers have learned to recognize differently, and that separates the two groups with unusual clarity. There's a specific feeling that lives in the chest just before you raise your hand. Not the hand you raise in agreement or the hand that goes up automatically because the answer is obvious and the risk is zero. The other hand, the one you consider raising when the room is quiet and the question is hard and nobody else is moving, and something in you knows, with a clarity that is almost physical, that you have something worth contributing. That hand, the one that stays down. Most people know this feeling intimately, on the moment of almost. The breath taken in preparation for speaking that gets quietly released as silence instead. The idea offered to a trusted colleague after the meeting that would have changed the meeting if it had been offered inside it. The decision to wait for a better moment that somehow never arrives with quite the same combination of readiness and opportunity. This is not cowardice in any meaningful sense of the word. The people who experience this most acutely are often among the most capable in the room. What they are experiencing is something more specific and more interesting than fear of failure. It is the fear of visibility. Failure, in the abstract, most ambitious people can tolerate. They have developed narratives about resilience and learning in the long game. What is harder, significantly harder and far less discussed, is the specific vulnerability of being seen trying, of stepping into the open space publicly and reaching for something publicly, and having the outcome of that reach observed by people whose opinion you carry with you. There is a man named Elliot, 41 years old, a senior engineer at a manufacturing firm in Birmingham who had spent 16 years being quietly exceptional and loudly invisible. His technical knowledge was, by the consensus of everyone who worked with him, extraordinary. His contributions to projects were consistently the difference between solutions that worked and solutions that worked elegantly. And for 16 years, he had delivered those contributions in the most indirect way available, through written reports, through quiet conversations with immediate colleagues, through work that spoke without him ever having to. When a new division director arrived and began holding open strategy sessions, inviting contribution from all levels of the organization, Elliot attended everyone. He sat in the third row. He prepared notes before each session that contained, by any objective measure, the most sophisticated thinking in the room. And in session after session, he watched those sessions proceed without his notes, without his thinking, without his voice, while other people, less prepared, less precise, occasionally less correct, shaped the direction of discussions that would determine the work he and his colleagues did for the next 2 years. The cost of his silence was not abstract. It was measured in outcomes. Decisions made without his input that his input would have improved. A division strategy with visible gaps that he could see and could not bring himself to name aloud. And a growing private frustration that had nowhere to go because he had chosen over and over the safety of invisibility over the risk of contribution. What Elliot was navigating is one of the most under-examined psychological dynamics in professional life. The social risk of initiative, the particular exposure that comes from being the person who stepped forward, who named the problem, who proposed the direction, and who therefore owns the outcome of that naming in a way that the silent observer never has to. The silent observer is safe. The silent observer cannot be wrong in public. The silent observer never has to defend a position, absorb a challenge, or experience the specific discomfort of having their thinking examined and found incomplete by people they respect. The silent observer pays for this safety in a currency that feels invisible in the short term and becomes impossible to ignore over a career. Ask yourself honestly, where in your current professional life are you choosing the safety of the third row? Because the cost of chronic invisibility is not just missed opportunities, though it is certainly that. It is something more corrosive. Over time, the habit of withholding, of consistently editing yourself down to a safer, smaller, less exposed version, begins to change your relationship with your own judgment. You stop trusting it, not because it has become less reliable, but because it has been so rarely tested in public that it has lost the quality that public testing develops. The confidence that comes not from always being right, but from the accumulated experience of surviving being wrong. The people who have developed genuine confidence in their contributions, the kind of confidence that looks effortless from the outside, have almost universally built it through repeated exposure to exactly the discomfort Eliot was avoiding. They raised the hand when it was uncertain. They offered the idea when the outcome was not guaranteed. They stepped into the open space consistently enough that the stepping eventually became less charged, less dramatic, more simply what they do. This is not a personality trait that some people have and others lack. It is a skill, a specific, learnable, practicable skill that develops through use and atrophies through avoidance. The introvert who prepares carefully and then contributes precisely can build as much professional visibility as the extrovert who speaks fluidly and often. The mechanism is different. The outcome, over time, is equivalent. Eliot eventually made a different choice. It happened not gradually, but in a single meeting, during a discussion about a supply chain decision he knew was being approached from entirely the wrong angle. The cost of staying silent that particular time felt, for the first time, larger than the cost of speaking. He spoke. His contribution redirected the discussion. The director looked at him with an expression that suggested he was being seen, perhaps for the first time, in the correct dimensions. It did not feel triumphant. It felt uncomfortable and necessary and slightly anticlimactic, which is, it turns out, almost exactly what initiative feels like from the inside. The cinematic version, the confident voice, the dramatic turn, the room falling silent in admiration, is a fiction. The real version is quieter, messier, and considerably more available than most people believe. But what happens when the stakes are not just professional visibility? What happens when initiative is required not in a strategy session, but in a genuine crisis? When the pressure is real, the consequences are significant, and the ownership trait is tested not against mild social discomfort, but against something that actually costs something to claim? Pressure does not build character. It reveals it. That line has been repeated often enough to feel like a platitude. And platitudes have a way of losing their edges through overuse until they sit smooth and harmless in the mind, generating mild agreement and nothing else. So it is worth restoring the edge. Because what pressure actually reveals is not whether a person is good or bad, strong or weak, brave or frightened. What it reveals is where their ownership lives, how deep it goes, whether it is a behavior they perform in comfortable conditions, or a genuine orientation that holds its shape when the conditions become genuinely difficult. Most professional environments are not, in truth, high pressure most of the time. They contain stress, certainly. Deadlines, competing priorities, difficult relationships, resource constraints. These are real and they are constant. But they are a different category of challenge from the moments that arrive without warning and demand an immediate, visible, consequential response. The moments where the normal rules of professional conduct briefly suspend, and what emerges in their place is simply whoever a person actually is. These moments are rarer than the daily friction of professional life, and they are disproportionately important. There is a woman named Diana, operations director at a logistics company in Vancouver, who encountered one of these moments on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday morning. A software failure cascaded through the company's delivery tracking system at 6 a.m, affecting 17 active contracts and triggering what would become, within hours, a significant client crisis. Diana's CEO was on a flight. Her immediate superior was in back-to-back board meetings. The team that owned the technical system was pointing at the team that owned the client relationships, and the team that owned the client relationships was pointing back. In the organizational chart, this situation had no clear owner. In practice, it had whoever decided to claim it. Diana claimed it. Not heroically, not with a speech or a declaration or a visible assumption of command. She simply began making decisions. She pulled the relevant people into a room, assigned immediate roles, established a communication protocol with affected clients, and began working the problem from its most critical point outward. She did not have formal authority over all of the people she was directing. She did not wait to confirm that her involvement was sanctioned. She looked at the situation, assessed what it needed, and became what it needed. By the time her CEO landed and turned his phone on, the immediate crisis was contained and a recovery timeline was in place. His first question, when he reached Diana, was not about the failure. It was about her. Specifically, he wanted to understand how she had moved so quickly and with such clarity in a situation that had no designated owner. Her answer, by her own account, was simple. She said she had not thought about whether it was hers to solve. She had thought about what needed solving. That answer contains the entire ownership trait in a single sentence. The absence of the ownership question, the immediate substitution of the problem-solving question, the cognitive leap from who is responsible for this to what does this need, executed so automatically that it did not register as a choice. This is what pressure reveals, not whether a person will step up. Most people, given enough time and clarity and explicit permission, will step up. What it reveals is whether the stepping up requires those conditions, whether ownership is a decision that needs to be consciously made, or whether it is simply the first response that arrives. The people who perform best under genuine pressure are not the ones who feel least afraid. That is another fiction worth retiring. The most effective crisis responders experience fear, uncertainty, and the same cognitive narrowing under pressure that everyone experiences. What distinguishes them is a different relationship with those states. They have developed, through accumulated experience and deliberate practice, the capacity to act through discomfort rather than waiting for it to resolve before acting. This capacity is not innate. It is built. It is built through the small daily practice of claiming ownership in low-stakes ambiguous situations. The meeting without a clear agenda, the problem without a clear owner, the junior colleague without a clear guide. Every time a person chooses to step into one of those smaller ambiguous spaces, they are building the neural and psychological infrastructure for stepping into the larger ones. The pressure moment does not create the owner. It reveals the owner that the daily practice has been quietly constructing. There is another dimension to high-pressure ownership that is worth examining carefully, because it is the dimension most often handled poorly. What happens when the crisis was caused, in part, by a decision you made? When the pressure moment is not a neutral emergency you are heroically resolving, but a difficulty that your own judgment contributed to creating? This is where the ownership trait is tested most severely. Because the instinct in that moment, the deeply human, entirely understandable instinct, is toward self-protection, toward emphasizing the external factors, the unpredictable variables, the ways in which the outcome could not have been foreseen, toward constructing a narrative that preserves the ego at the cost of the truth. The ownership thinker does something different. They do something that is, in the short term, considerably more uncomfortable and, in the long term, considerably more powerful. They name their role clearly. Not dramatically, not with excessive self-flagellation, but with the clean precision discussed earlier. They say, my decision contributed to this. Here is what I should have seen that I did not. Here is what I'm doing to correct the course. This behavior, in a pressure moment, does something remarkable to the people watching it. It creates trust at a depth that competence alone never reaches, because competence tells people you can handle the work. But honest accountability under pressure tells people something more fundamental, that you can be trusted when things are hard, and that your version of events will be accurate even when accuracy is costly to you personally. That is the foundation of the kind of leadership that people actually follow. Not because they are required to, because they have decided, based on direct evidence, that following you is the safest and most productive place to be. And yet, there is a final layer to this that most discussions of ownership never reach. Because individual character, however well developed, does not operate in a vacuum. It operates inside environments. And some environments are designed, whether intentionally or not, to consume ownership rather than cultivate it. Not every environment deserves your ownership. That sentence will feel uncomfortable to some people, particularly those who have built their identity around the idea that genuine ownership means giving everything, everywhere, always. But it is one of the most important distinctions available to anyone who wants to sustain high performance over a full career, rather than burning brilliantly for 3 years and arriving at 40 feeling inexplicably hollowed out. The ownership trait is a resource. Like all resources, it can be invested wisely or spent carelessly. And the environments in which you choose to invest it matter as much as the trade itself, possibly more. There's a particular type of organization, and most people who have spent time in professional environments have encountered at least one, that presents itself as a meritocracy, while functioning as something considerably more complex. It uses the language of ownership and accountability and initiative in its values documents, in its town halls, and its leadership development programs. It celebrates these qualities in the abstract. And then, in practice, it systematically punishes the behaviors that those qualities produce. The person who raises a difficult question gets managed. The person who names a structural problem gets labeled a troublemaker. The person who takes initiative outside their defined role gets told, with varying degrees of directness, to stay in their lane. The formal system rewards compliance and consistency. The informal system rewards proximity to power. And the people who spend years bringing genuine ownership energy to this environment eventually discover that they have been, in a very specific sense, paying into an account that was never going to pay out. Meet a man named Thomas, 43 years old, 15 years at a large financial services firm in Boston. Thomas had built, over that decade and a half, exactly the kind of informal authority described earlier in this journey. His colleagues trusted him. His team followed him naturally. His judgment on complex problems was sought by people 3 levels above him in the hierarchy. By any reasonable measure, he had demonstrated everything the organization claimed to value, and he had been passed over for senior leadership 5 times. Not because his performance reviews were weak, they were exceptional. Not because he lacked supporters, he had them at multiple levels, but because the organization's actual selection criteria for senior leadership, the ones that operated beneath the stated criteria, in the informal conversations and the closed-door calibrations, were organized around a different set of qualities entirely. Loyalty to existing power structures, comfort with the way things had always been done, a specific kind of social fluency that had more to do with managing upward than with leading outward. Thomas was excellent at leading outward. He had never particularly mastered managing upward, partly because it did not come naturally, and partly because some part of him had always felt that results should speak for themselves. In this particular environment, they did not. The question of what Thomas should have done earlier is less important than the question of what he eventually understood, which is this. The environment was not broken in a way that more ownership energy could fix. It was operating exactly as designed. The design simply did not align with what he was offering. Recognizing this distinction between an environment that is temporarily difficult and one that is structurally misaligned with genuine ownership is one of the most valuable and least practiced skills in professional life. It requires a particular kind of clear-eyed honesty that is difficult because it forces a choice. Either the environment changes, which is possible but usually slow and uncertain, or you change environments, which is immediate but carries its own costs and risks. What makes this recognition so difficult is that the 2 situations feel almost identical from the inside. An organization that is going through a difficult period and genuinely values the ownership you bring will feel frustrating. An organization that is structurally organized against ownership will also feel frustrating. The frustration is not the diagnostic. The diagnostic is something subtler. Ask yourself these questions with genuine honesty. When you take initiative in your current environment, does it generate results that are acknowledged, even informally? When you model accountability, does it create space for others to do the same? Or does it simply provide cover for those who do not? When you invest in the team's outcomes beyond your defined role, does the organization respond by giving you more access, more trust, more interesting problems? Or does it simply take the additional output while your formal standing remains unchanged? The answers to those questions are data, not feelings, not impressions, not a bad week filtered through a bad mood. Data, and the ability to read that data accurately without either the cynicism that gives up too quickly or the loyalty that stays too long, is what separates people who build careers of sustained impact from people who build careers of sustained frustration. There are also environments that are genuinely in transition, organizations that are changing their culture, shifting their values, building new leadership frameworks, where ownership energy invested now will pay returns over a longer timeline than feels immediately comfortable. These are worth distinguishing from the structurally resistant organizations, because they reward patience in a way the others never will. The diagnostic there is different. Look not at the stated values, but at the behavior of the most senior people when they face a genuine choice between the stated culture and their personal comfort. Culture is not what an organization says it believes. Culture is what its leadership does when doing the right thing is inconvenient. Thomas eventually left, not in anger, not in defeat, but with a clarity that had taken longer to arrive than it should have. He joined a smaller organization in a different sector, one where the leadership were visibly, demonstrably practicing the ownership behaviors they asked of others. Within 2 years, he had the senior role. Within 4, he was building a team culture that reflected everything he had understood through 15 years of operating in an environment that could not use what he was offering. The ownership trait did not fail him. The environment failed to deserve it. And the final question, and the one this entire journey has been building toward, is not about environment at all. It is about something more fundamental than where you work, or who you work for, or what system you're operating inside. It is about who you're deciding to be. There is a difference between doing ownership and being an owner. It is the same difference that exists between practicing kindness as a deliberate act and being a kind person, between performing courage when the situation demands it and being someone for whom courage is simply the natural response. The behaviors may look identical from the outside. The internal experience is entirely different. And the internal experience is what determines whether the behaviors hold under pressure, sustain over time, and compound into something that fundamentally changes the shape of a life. This distinction is where most leadership development stops short. It identifies the behaviors, the initiative, the accountability, the proactive engagement, the willingness to step into ambiguous spaces, and it teaches them as practices. Do this, say this, position yourself this way. And the practices are not wrong. They are useful, and for many people, they are the necessary first step. But they are not the destination, because behaviors practiced without a corresponding identity shift are inherently fragile. They require constant conscious maintenance. They are the first thing to drop when conditions become difficult, when fatigue sets in, when the environment pushes back hard enough and long enough that maintaining the performance begins to feel unsustainable. The person who has made the identity shift does not maintain ownership behaviors. They express ownership naturally, the way a musician who has truly internalized their instrument no longer thinks about technique. The technique is present. It is more present than ever, but it is no longer the object of attention. It has become the medium through which something deeper moves. Consider what this shift actually requires, because it is not a decision made once and then complete. It is not a single moment of resolution, however powerful, that permanently rewires a person's relationship to authority and initiative and responsibility. It is something more gradual, more iterative, and in some ways more demanding than any single act of courage. It is the slow accumulation of evidence gathered through lived experience that you're someone who can be trusted with difficulty, that you can step into uncertainty and navigate it, that you can absorb accountability without being destroyed by it, that your judgment, imperfect as it is and will always be, is reliable enough to be acted on without waiting for external confirmation. That evidence does not come from reading about ownership. It does not come from understanding it intellectually, however deeply. It comes from doing the thing repeatedly in real conditions, with real stakes, and discovering through direct personal experience that the doing is survivable and, over time, increasingly natural. There is a name for this process in developmental psychology. It is called identity consolidation, the gradual process through which behaviors that were once deliberate and effortful become integrated into a person's stable sense of self. It happens at every stage of human development, most visibly in adolescence, but continuously throughout adult life. And it can be deliberately accelerated, not by trying harder to be different, but by consistently acting as the person you are becoming until the acting and the being are no longer distinguishable. This is the final and most important insight of this entire journey. You do not wait until you feel like an owner to act like one. You act like one, consistently and specifically, and in the particular contexts where it costs you something to do so, until the feeling follows the action. Because the feeling always follows the action, never the reverse. Waiting to feel ready is the most sophisticated form of the permission trap. The internal version, the one that does not require anyone else's approval, because it has constructed an approval process entirely within your own psychology. Think about the people encountered throughout this journey. Marcus, waiting for recognition that was never going to arrive through patience alone. Priya, discovering that the map of her education did not match the territory of her ambition. Simone, leading quietly and consistently until the title caught up with the reality. Jordan, learning that accountability is a scalpel, not a whip. Claire, finding that the signals she had been sending were readable and changeable. Elliot discovering that the cost of silence eventually exceeded the cost of speech. Diana stepping into a crisis that had no designated owner and becoming its owner simply by deciding to. Thomas investing ownership energy in an environment that could not return it and eventually finding one that could. Each of these people arrived at the same threshold from a different direction. The threshold between performing ownership and inhabiting it, between doing the behaviors and becoming the person for whom the behaviors are simply an expression of character. What that threshold looks like in your specific life, in your specific role, your specific organization, your specific relationships, is something only you can identify. But the direction is consistent. It is always inward before it is outward. It is always identity before behavior. It is always the quiet internal decision made and remade across hundreds of ordinary moments that you are not waiting for anyone to hand you the authority to be who you already are. That decision is available right now, not at the next performance review, not when the circumstances are better or the environment is more supportive or the timing is cleaner. Now, in whatever situation you're currently navigating, there's a version of you that does not wait for the signal, that steps forward with what is available, that treats the situation as theirs to influence, the problem as theirs to engage, the outcome as theirs to own. That version of you is not an aspiration. It is not a future self waiting to be unlocked by the right opportunity or the right mentor or the right set of circumstances. It is who you already are, underneath the conditioning and the waiting and the accumulated habit of asking for permission you were never required to ask for. The only question that has ever mattered is the one you choose to stop asking. There is a moment, usually quiet and unremarkable from the outside, when something settles. Not the dramatic resolution of a long struggle, not the triumphant arrival at a destination after years of difficult travel. Something simpler and more durable than either of those things. A settling, the particular internal stillness that comes when a person stops arguing with themselves about who they are allowed to be and begins, finally and without fanfare, simply being it. That moment is different for everyone. For some, it arrives after a crisis navigated, a risk taken, a silence broken at cost. For others, it arrives in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, in a meeting room or on a commute or in the quiet before the day begins, as a thought that surfaces not with drama, but with the quiet authority of something that has always been true and has simply been waiting to be acknowledged. What you have traveled through in this audiobook is not a set of techniques. It is not a framework to be implemented, or a checklist to be completed, or a performance to be maintained. It is an invitation to look honestly at the single most consequential relationship in your professional life, the relationship between you and your own authority, between the capability you carry and the permission you have been waiting for to use it fully. The permission was never coming from outside. It was never going to arrive in an email or a promotion or a conversation with someone above you who finally saw what you were worth. Those things may come, and they will be welcome when they do, but they are not the source. They were never the source. Every person examined in this journey discovered the same thing from a different angle, that ownership is not granted. It is assumed, quietly, specifically, in the particular moments where assuming it costs something real, visibility, comfort, the safety of remaining unexamined, and that the assuming, done consistently and honestly over time, builds something that no external validation can replicate and no external circumstance can permanently remove. You carry more authority than you have been using. Not borrowed authority, not positional authority, not authority contingent on someone else's recognition. The authority that comes from clear judgment, genuine accountability, and the willingness to be the person in the room who treats the situation as theirs to influence. That authority has always been yours. The only thing that changes today is whether you act like it.